Well, thank you all for coming today. I'm Megan Doherty, the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. It's great to have you here and with us on Zoom. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Penobscot, and Wabanaki peoples. We are grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put a link in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée des Wabanaki in Quebec. If you've attended one of our other talks this winter, you've heard me mention the research I've been doing on the culturally important brown ash tree and the important work being done by the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanakik project at Maine. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ella McDonald and Tyler Everett to kick off this semester's Spotlight on the Humanities and Sustainability Studies lecture series, which is supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Ella is a non-native master's student in ecology and environmental science at UMaine, and Tyler is a citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation and a PhD student in the School of Forest Resources, also at UMaine. Emily Francis, a PhD candidate as well at UMaine, was not able to join us today as she's putting the finishing touches on her dissertation before she submits it in the next few weeks. But Ella and Tyler will be sharing information about her research as well. So thank you both for making the trip over, and we look forward to learning from you today.
Thank you. Gwe, Wabanaki, Mi'kmaq, Talawisi, Tyler Everett. Greetings, I'm a person of the Dawn. I am Mi'kmaq, and my name is Tyler Everett. Going to be talking today about our work in the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanaki, or APCAW lab group at the University of Maine. And our presentation is APCAW, mobilizing the protection of the culturally significant brown ash trees, or Wiskook or Wigib. Wiskook is the traditional way you'd say brown ash in Mi'kmaq, and Wiccup is Passamaquoddy, Penobscot. Next slide. There. All right, so it's right in our name that we're trying to protect ash trees. And so centered at the core of all the work that we do is this one tree, which I think in its own, it speaks volumes to how important the tree is and how serious we take our work in protecting this tree. And really it's all ash trees, but the brown or black ash tree, as many of you know, is very culturally significant. Brown ash, if you've seen it in the forest, it likes its feet wet. So you probably had your muck boots on. You might have been on a floodplain, on a river terrace, or maybe in a depressional wetland. In any case, you'd have those rubber boots on because it'd be pretty wet, especially this time of year, right? We got the flood warning just down the road, so it'd be very wet today in these sites. But they're really unique. If you are a forester and you see a lot of forests, when you're going through the woods and you find brown ash, a lot of times it gets you to stop because it's a stark change in the forest overstory. It's a unique forested habitat, and there's a lot of unique flora and fauna that rely on these forests to survive. It's a shade intolerant species, so in these floodplains and in these river terraces, impacts that have taken out the overstory bring lots of light down to the forest floor, and these forests can start. They like a lot of direct sunlight. They also deliver a lot of nutrients to the soil. Brown ash or all ash species are some of the last of our deciduous hardwoods to get their leaves early spring, and then some of the first to cast their leaves in the fall. There's a high carbon to nitrogen ratio for brown ash tree foliage. And so that's a lot of nutrients that gets loaded into these ecosystems. They also allow light to get down to the forest floor at times when other forest trees wouldn't, right? If they're going to cast their leaves earlier, they're going to open up that canopy and light will get down and offer that opportunity for growth of our understory plants and trees that need that light and would otherwise not if it was some other tree species. And so I mentioned all of that just to point out that it's a very unique ecosystem. And as we think about climate change and we think about resilient forests, any species that offers unique characteristics are important for making resilient ecosystems. And brown ash is a major component to that. Next slide. And as I alluded to, it's highly culturally significant. So the people of the Dawn, the Wabanaki, and many, really anywhere that brown ash is, and there are indigenous people to that land, they've worked with this tree to make baskets. It's pretty synonymous, particularly here in the Northeast, the North Maine woods. You think about that pack basket. It's used by trappers, it's used by outdoorsmen, but really traditionally that shape, as you can see over there on that large pack basket, that fits in the hull of a canoe. And so it's critically important as you move through the North Woods on canoe, which was our highways way back when we didn't have today. And so critically important to a way of life. It's also a huge economic source to basket makers. Families have generations of basket makers in them. These stories, these teachings, these motifs that they use in their baskets for more artistic, fancy baskets have been passed down from generation to generation. People get together and they process the material. They get together, they weave the material into baskets. They're dyeing the splints together. It's a communal event, and it brings people together on a cultural practice, basketry. It's also got this tie to our creation story, the people of the Dawn. There's one of our creation stories uses brown ash in it. And so it's cited in one of our creation stories. So now that we think about this cultural significance, this tie to an economic livelihood for many families, its unique spot in the ecosystem and its value there, all these different significance considerations for the tree, now it's at threat by the emerald ash borer. So next slide. So the threat is the emerald ash borer. It arrived in the US in 2002 in Southeast Michigan. It was likely there for some time when they did some surveys that it had probably been there for quite a little chunk of time before we detected it. But since it's been detected, it's spread very rapidly. So right now there's detections in 36 states and 5 Canadian provinces. If you look at that land for which emerald ash borers impacting ash forests, that's 117 federally recognized tribal nations. And as I mentioned, if there are indigenous peoples in the range of brown ash, they're using this material, it's culturally important and significant to their people. And so there's a wide range of impact by this pest. The way that it kills ash trees is it lays its eggs in early spring on the bark. Those eggs hatch and then larvae bore into the tree. They feed on the phloem, disrupting the flow of nutrients and water in the tree. And because there's no defense to emerald ash borer, and populations spike so high because there's no native, there are some native biological controls of the pest, but not enough to bring populations down to a controllable level. You see that these trees have riddled with these galleries where emerald ash borer is feeding, and it girdles the tree and kills it. Next slide. We did a little bit of editing with these images to bring together the 2 quarantine maps.
Very high tech.
Very high tech. So as you can see, there's a lot of detections in southern Maine and southern New Hampshire. And that's sort of the epicenter of where emerald ash borer spread has been very rampant. And it's moved up the west coast of Maine. And you see a lot of satellite detections. Even in New Hampshire, you still see those towns in which there's just a green dot that's secluded. But those are generally because of the movement of firewood or other material, ash material that carried emerald ash borer to this spot. Those are things that are human induced, right? We've moved the pest to a new location and it's emerged and started a new satellite infestation. That's something we can try to slow down by not moving firewood. It's still an important thing, even if emerald ash borer is in your state, to consider when you're going up to camp. And in Maine, we have 2, it's kind of cut off by the top of the Zoom, but we also have a quarantine in northern Maine. it's moving much slower up there because things are colder. And the life cycle is generally 2 years for emerald ash borer there, whereas in southern Maine, central Maine, it's a 1 year life cycle, and it can spread more rapidly. Plus, there's lots more movement of firewood and campwood in southern Maine. Next slide. I'm going to pass it to Ella.
I also will say about the quarantine in New Hampshire, we looked it up and there's a ban on moving firewood from states with EAB in it into New Hampshire, but there's no in-state quarantine. I think Maine is one of the last states to have an in-state quarantine that prevents the movement within the state. But Tyler talked a bit about the concern that we have with emerald ash borer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing about it. So the initial concern about emerald ash borer was raised by basket makers from tribal nations, but tribal nations recognize that they only steward and manage about less than 2% of their traditional territory across the Northeast, even less if you include New Hampshire and Vermont. So they knew that they had to start working with many other partners. So they've immediately went to researchers at University of Maine, notably John Daigle and Darren Ranko, who we work really closely with. They're our advisors and the leaders of this project, as well as state representatives and federal representatives and other researchers who they thought could help start to think about how to manage emerald ash borer. And as this visibility around emerald ash borer has grown, we've also welcomed a lot of new collaborators. You can see it, all the logos of people who we work with now. And just in 2022, we actually had 27 land trusts dedicate 2,000 hours of volunteer and staff time to ash protection, as well as $20,000. So we have a lot of folks working on private land, conserved land, to help show up for this issue, which is really important because invasive species are a collective management issue, not just an individual management issue. Even if the tribes did as much as they possibly could on their land, emerald ash borer was still going to spread from the south and from the north. So it's really important that we work together. So you have to click it. Yeah. Yeah, so recently, last year, we saw a need to start working under a new name. Previously, when basket makers raised the issue of emerald ash borer, they were calling their group the Brown Ash Task Force. But recently we won a grant to start working on more education and outreach. So we named ourselves, through collaboration with tribal communities, the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanakik. And we're a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and forest caretakers, and we're working together to take actions to protect ash. And you may be wondering, what is Wabanakik? So it's a term that has a lot of different meanings in different Algonquin languages, but it's understood generally to mean in the land of the people of the dawn. And that includes parts of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and all the way out. I guess this map doesn't really include it, but New Hampshire and Vermont as well, up into parts of Canada. So we're really hoping to gain partnerships in all of these areas, not just in Maine, to represent the traditional territories of the Wabanaki people. Next slide. So to get the word out and start organizing people, we co-created 2 avenues of ways that people can get information about how to protect ash. The first was a webinar and workshop series. And in 2023, we had 10 events that reached over 900 people, where we trained people in practical ways to protect ash. We had a lot of fun. We got out on the land. Tyler had 2 ash inventory trainings that were actually on really bad weather days. There were days like today, and we still had over 50 people come out to both of those events, even in the rain, and we walked through muddy brown ash forests, so that was pretty impressive. And then we also held an ash seed collection training in September. Some of my favorite programs were a webinar on the cultural importance of brown ash that featured a panel of Wabanaki people. And we did a session on ash genetics. And if you're interested in going in and learning deeper about any of these topics, we have a YouTube channel. So through that QR code, you could access that. Yeah, and our ultimate goal was to generate collective engagement in ash protection and build really a community of practice around ash protection. And the second avenue that we created was a website. And so the state of Maine has a really great website, and we looked a little bit into New Hampshire's website too, and they have great resources about monitoring and how to identify ash. But we saw a need to go beyond and offer more information and a resource library about the cultural importance of brown ash, as well as additional materials about seed collection that were a little bit more accessible and easy to use than the state resources. But this is intended as a living website, so we hope that it'll keep being updated as new research comes out, new strategies come out. And in 2024, we're going to be hosting a brown ash conference, October 8th and 9th at UMaine Orono. And we're hoping to feature a lot of the new research that's coming out around brown ash and how to protect ash, as well as we're going to feature some basket makers and Wabanaki perspectives about protecting ash as well. Next slide.
Our URL down here is very simple, umaine.edu/APCAW, so easy to remember.
Super easy.
Ability to scan.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'll turn it to Tyler to talk a bit about what are some of the strategies that you can take to protect ash.
So I've organized some thoughts on what you can do to respond to emerald ash borer as a landowner. And I've been talking about these with the tribal communities that we partner with and tribal natural resource and forestry staff to kind of generate some conversation about whether or not these practices are appropriate in such a culturally significant place, these brown ash forests. So that conversation's occurring, but a lot of these practices, especially west of the Dawnland, as emerald ash borer has started to take effect more, even here. I mean, I passed quite a few ash trees that have succumbed to emerald ash borer just near here as we made our way through the White Mountains. And so some of these practices are already underway in a lot of places. And I've organized it less time and less money, because as a landowner, you only have so much time, you only have so much money that you can spend on protecting your forest. And some of the things that you can think about on that end of the spectrum, all the way to the ones that require more time or more money. But even with that said, there are programs that make that more accessible. Hopefully, because we're pushing how important this work is, more of those programs become available over time. So silviculture, again, regionally and for the site specific, thinking about best management practices. What can we do to protect both the water quality, the site conditions, and then in the case of ash, if we're thinking long-term, maintaining a component of ash in the forest, that as a best management practice, right? If we talked about how these unique trees offer different characteristics that other trees won't be able to replace. One being the cultural significance, but also some of these unique ecological characteristics that would be lost. So one best management practice to consider is leaving ash in some of these forests and trying to promote new regeneration, hoping that it may survive that initial wave. And that's really the goal with this silviculture strategy. A lot of early on strategies were, let's cut all of our ash ahead of emerald ash borer. There's an economic value, there's a kickback or return to the landowner or the land manager to make money off of the timber cut in that sort of practice. You can balance that. You still can go and get some of the premium logs ahead of emerald ash borer and think about doing a timber sale, but in that practice, also try and protect the next generation. So offer opportunities for regenerating more ash that can be maintained, and then also taking time to leave some select seed source trees. Brown ash and all ash are polygamodioecious, so you can find a male individual, a female individual, or a polygamous individual that has more male parts or more female parts. But in any case, all three of those individuals need to be there to carry out sexual reproduction for ash. And if we don't have a seed source, we can't maintain it into the future as successfully. So finding those female trees is a big part of the inventory and then a big consideration in silviculture. And then what we've learned from a lot of basket makers is that majority of the ash that they're harvesting for the production of baskets actually doesn't come from tribal trust lands. It comes from private land. And in the Northeast, and especially in Maine, 89% of land is privately owned. And so basket makers do require on these handshake agreements, sometimes written agreements with landowners to access the land for cultural resources. Some of the larger land management companies are starting to think about permits for access and harvest of cultural important plants, and that's something to think about. Then there's also the idea of co-management. These forests are areas where if there isn't an interest on part of the landowner to protect these ash, working with a local indigenous community or a tribal nation could help bring that influence in and make sure their perspective's not lost. Then there's land return, right? If they want to access the land, if they want to try and take care of this relative brown ash, the best way to do that is for them to take full control of how that's carried out. And so that's something you can consider too. If you have brown ash wetland forest that can't be developed, can't be harvested because it's wet 90% of the year, maybe it could go to the tribe and the tribe could take care of it and utilize that land and try to protect ash long term. Even if we're in an emerald ash borer detected area where we know emerald ash borer is, it's still sometimes important to know of a specific location of emerald ash borer. There are pockets of brown ash in particular that are along stream corridors or in floodplains that haven't been touched by emerald ash borer, even though they're surrounded by quarantine or other detections. It's still worthwhile to maybe do a trap tree to figure out exactly when the detection of emerald ash borer at that particular site occurs, as it can help you time different management strategies. Basket makers would know that there was emerald ash borer there and to be more cautious in terms of moving that material. That's also going to be effective outside of the quarantine zone. In the case of New Hampshire, there isn't a quarantine zone, but there are some areas that haven't been detected yet. If you're going to do the insecticide treatments or the biological controls, you can't do those until emerald ash borer is there. So you have to monitor to figure out when it arrives so that you can take those actions in an effective way once emerald ash borer arrives. And so the New Hampshire Department of State of Lands and Forest would be the people to contact about that. And then there's NewHampshireBug.org or NewHampshireBugs.org. The one leading a lot of the insecticide treatments and trying to find long-term sites for monitoring emerald ash borer and maintaining ash is Kyle Lombard. And he's got the protocol for finding these sites. Great thing about here in New Hampshire is that anytime there's brown ash, it's automatically elevated to a site that they want to protect. So if you have brown ash on your forest, you should reach out to Kyle and he would be more than happy to come and protect those trees with chemical treatment. Next slide. Talked about this, the biological controls. So early on, when we learned about emerald ash borer, we sent scientists to the native range of emerald ash borer and found what I explained earlier don't exist here, which are those natural enemies of emerald ash borer. So we found parasitic wasps. And when you say parasitic wasps, you think of ones that would sting you. These are really small. They don't sting. They're non-stinging wasps. But they do use their stinger, their ovipositor, to lay their eggs. And the way that these parasitoids work is they either lay their eggs into the eggs of emerald ash borer or into the larvae of emerald ash borer. In either case, it promotes that biological control to perpetuate itself, create a new generation, and it kills emerald ash borer. And so it's a natural enemy of emerald ash borer that we're releasing here. You have to be cognizant to think about non-target impacts, right? So USDA-APHIS, the agency that leads this program federally, has state cooperators or tribal nation cooperators that have signed on to do these releases, but they can't go forward with that step until they do the testing. And so they've done really rigorous testing to make sure these parasitic wasps are very host specific to emerald ash borer. And they haven't found any alternative hosts or natives that are being impacted by these parasitic wasps. That's not to say that it won't happen, right? There's always a risk, but in this case, the literature, a lot of the leading researchers say that the risk is far outweighed by the reward of having natural enemies. And then I talked about insecticides. This would be all the way on the end of the spectrum here, of terms of time and money, but injecting these trees with a chemical treatment can maintain that seed source. If they're a seed producing tree, we can maintain that seed source for years to come, even when emerald ash borer comes through. So emerald ash borer comes through, but you've maintained a seed source in the overstory. It allocates growing space because a lot of trees will die because of emerald ash borer, but those ones you've injected have a seed source that can rain down and be the next generation of ash trees at that site. And the hope is that after that initial wave comes through, things like the biological controls, things like silviculture that's secured a next generation, allow a situation where ash trees, emerald ash borer, and these biological controls and other native and natural enemies of emerald ash borer can all maintain an equilibrium, and we have ash trees in a future condition. This would be like how you would price it out in terms of how much it would cost to inject these trees. And there's a trade-off, right? You're injecting the tree and you've got to re-inject it every 3 years. And it slowly narrows the margin of whether or not it's cost effective, because there's also the cost of removing the tree or replacing the tree, especially if it's near your home or near power lines. And so that trade-off is considered, but that's oftentimes for when it's near something, or if it's a really intrinsically valuable tree. In the forested setting, it's a lot of times overlooked as a strategy, but it's being explored now as a strategy for protecting really high priority sites. Back to Ellen.
I'm gonna try to do justice to Emily Francis's part. She usually does the seed collection part, but I'm also really excited about this strategy because it doesn't, I mean, it's really fun when it comes down to it, to go out into the woods and collect seed with other people. And I think this is a great way to get a lot of people involved in ash protection. It takes some time and a little bit of money, but I'm hoping that we can create these hubs where the materials are available for people to do seed collection and engage with it. Next slide. So why is it important to collect ash seed? The need to collect ash seed was again raised by tribal nations, and the folks really leading this are the St. Regis Mohawk Akwesasne tribe. And they started collecting seed almost 20 years ago because EAB was impacting them in upstate New York quite some time ago. And they've been growing out ash in a greenhouse for probably about 15 years. But there are a number of different ways that ash seed can be used. The first is safekeeping in seed banks. There are a number of national seed bank facilities that can do deep freeze and keep seeds around for future plantings of seed. There's also a supply for current plantings of ash seed so that we can keep ash on the landscape, keep it growing out. There are a number of different nurseries appearing. The Akwesasne nursery is one. There might be one coming down the pipeline in Sabayak on the Passamaquoddy Reservation. I know at University of Maine, we're going to start a nursery and start growing out some ash. And then also there's really important research going on at Penn State as well as out in the Midwest on genetics of ash trees. At Penn State, they're looking to just understand the genetic diversity within the total range of ash. They're not trying to do any genetic modification or anything like that, but just nobody's ever mapped brown ash before or white or green ash. So they're trying to understand what's out there. And then in the Midwest, they actually found this one stand of ash trees that had a very high survival rate to emerald ash borer when it came through. So they've taken some seeds from those trees, and they're trying to breed them to see about the possibility of there being lingering ash or ash that can survive after emerald ash borer infestation. So that's an example of some of the research that's going on around genetics. You can go to the next slide. So this is Emily Francis has done a really amazing job of creating a really easy to use guide for if you want to go out and participate in seed collection efforts. The need for this was raised again by tribal communities who called for a way to really easily access ways to collect seed. Because they found that the document that was created at a federal level was a little bit jargony. We wanted one that was super easy to read, super easy to understand, and really gives you a step-by-step guide that you can use to go out. And yeah, it goes through all the materials, all the steps that you need to take. You can go to the next slide. I think I have the steps. Also, I just wanted to say that we're in a really critical window of time to collect seed. I saw on the map of the EAB monitoring that there are still some areas in New Hampshire, especially northern New Hampshire, that have no EAB. And that won't be true for very long. So we are in a window where it's important to collect seed and get as much geographical diversity as possible before it's too late and we don't have any trees to collect from. EAB results in almost complete mortality of ash trees. So that could be the future that we're facing unless we have efforts like this. So brown ash seeds and flowers, unfortunately, every 7 years. Is that right? 7 years? Yeah, 7 to 8 years. But white ash is 3 to 5 years and green ash seeds every single year. So there you can get your start with green ash. In Maine, I think brown ash last seeded about 2 years ago. So we've got another about 5 years to wait until we have another seed year. I don't know if that's true in New Hampshire. But a great thing to do if you're starting to think about seed collection is to go out and do inventory of lands that you manage. In the spring, you'll start to see flowers in late April, early May. Over there, on the left is the female flower and the right is the male flower. They're kind of hard to see, so you may want to bring binoculars if you go out and start looking for them, because they're way up in the top. And then you can time your seed collection, prepare for seed collection right now by gathering materials. Some key materials are pole pruners and just paper bags to put your seed in. Anything additional to that is really extra. And then you'll collect seed. And then there's a lot of steps that you need to do to prepare them for storage, depending on where they're going. Some facilities require a lot more processing and viability testing, but some require almost none, like our fridge requires pretty much no processing and will do the processing for you. And then you'll send them to be stored. So go to the next slide. This is a great figure from Emily's manual that shows what you can do around seed collection based on different seasons. So a lot of this I already touched on, but scouting for flowers in the spring, monitoring seed growth in the summer, and then seed collection time is in September and October. I think the latest that you'll be able to collect, depending on windstorms, is about Indigenous Peoples' Day in October, so mid-October. I was seeing some seed on trees in early November this year, but that was green ash seed that I think just stuck around for a really long time. And then late fall is a good time to sort your seeds. And then winter is a great time to just plan for the next season. So here are some of the different facilities where you can send seed. At University of Maine, we actually just got a fridge, which is really exciting. And we can probably keep seeds viable for about 5 to 10 years, but it's not going to be a long-term storage facility. And all the seed that's sent to us will be prioritized for tribal nations, for tribal nurseries, and also for the research going on at University of Maine to do germination trials and figure out the best ways to grow ash out. And the second place you can send is to the USDA ARS facility in Iowa. And this can be requested back by people who collected it, but also by any researcher. So if you send it there, anybody can use it. So you don't really know what's going to happen to it. And they'll do the viability testing and the processing, which is really great. And that, if you keep seed there, I think it lasts for about 20 to 25 years. It's in deep freeze. Same with the black box. They've seen that it can last for like 20 to 25 years. But the USDA ARS facility in the Colorado Black Box is probably the most rigorous. They require viability testing and a lot of processing before you send it. So we recommend more Iowa or University of Maine probably, unless you want to really put in a lot of time and send your seed to the black box. But it's up to every collector to figure out where they want to send it and what they want to do with it. You could also grow it out in your backyard if you have an ash forest that you want to see future regeneration in. And on our website, there's some steps for how to do that backyard plantings. Next slide. Okay, I'm not that well versed in this, but I'll try. The first option is using a pole pruner. So you probably may have some pole pruners in your yard shed. So if you can get them long enough, you can cut off the stems that have seed on them. We recommend not collecting like all the seed off of a tree, just taking a little from each tree, and then filling a bag up separately with each seed from each tree. And then the second is a pocket rope saw. So you attach a pocket saw to two ropes, and then you kind of like go like this, right? Sorry. I haven't used that method. The one that I've done a lot, actually, wait, will you just go forward? And that's the pocket rope saw. This is the one that I've used a lot, the Big Shot. We were lucky to have one at University of Maine. But basically it's a rope attached to a weight and you send it up over a branch and then shake the branch. So it's like a more non-invasive way of getting seed off the tree without having to cut off the branch. And if you put out a tarp, then you'll see that a lot of the seed will fall to the ground, and naturally it'll leave some seed on the tree, which is great. And then, do you know the by hand or tarp basket method?
If you have a tree that's roadside, a lot of times they have lower hanging branches. Those lower hanging fruit are easier to collect. You can even sometimes, brown ash are really flexible, so you can bend it out over the road and grab it by hand and put it in your bag for drying. And for the rope saw, if you do the pocket rope saw, you should shoot your rope over first and then attach the rope saw. Don't send your rope saw over. That's dangerous.
Good point. Yeah, next slide.
That's one of the rope weights.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. I think that's all that we have, but I think we have time for questions, right? Yeah.
I'll come up and help moderate questions. And thank you both. We can start if there's questions in the room, and I'll stop the share and pull up the. Yeah, go ahead, whoever.
That was a great presentation. You answered a lot of questions ahead of time. I was really curious about what's being done to try to attack this wretched creature. And we mentioned several, I love those little wasps, but a lot of interesting things going on there. I'm also, well, we both used to live in Michigan, in the dreaded area where this thing showed up. In fact, I had an ash that I planted, nurtured, and then watched it get attacked by these things. And my method, it's a little hole that it bores in them. And I would take a little pin and poke it whenever it came out, I'd poke it. But that didn't actually work. I had to cut the tree down.
Right.
So I was curious to see what's being done to try to attack this. I'm also curious about this, that there is some diversity within the existing population such that the emerald ash borer is not equally effective at killing off every single tree. You mentioned somewhere in Michigan, it seems to higher resistance. I'm intrigued at the idea, although you seem to be uncomfortable with some sort of genetic research that would maybe manipulated so a new generation would be more resistant. That seems possible. So I guess my question is, you put a lot of emphasis on collecting seeds. And so I guess the question is, you know, if the emerald ash borer will, it seems like it'll attack eventually every single ash. They don't overlook ash trees. And so, it seems to me kind of discouraging to plant seeds and knowing that they're going to get attacked. And so I'm curious what the direction is here, what the emphasis is, just to keep, if you put them in a deep freeze, that's great. And so maybe generations from now or decades from now, there'll be a more effective way of protecting trees. But what's the goal in collecting all these? Could you run over that again for me, these seeds, because that seems to be an important part of the work here.
Yeah. So the seed collection, we're definitely in support and want to explore the genetic, especially breeding programs. Breeding programs can try to bring back what is produced that might have some genetic resistance to emerald ash borer as close to North American brown ash as possible. Genetic modification, when you start to think about genetic modification as a culturally important plant, lots of conversation should be had with the tribal community to figure out how appropriate that is and how to proceed with that. So that's where we have some pause and we want to make sure doing what we can to work with the right people. As far as collecting the seed though, if we collect a bunch of seed and then we do come up with a genetically resistant variety of brown ash or other ash species, if we don't know how to effectively plant it out on the landscape in these sites where it currently exists and thrives, then it will be worthless, right? Especially if emerald ash borer comes through and wipes out a stand that was mature and it devastates it to a point where it doesn't come back to brown ash. Then our task down the line is to not only try to replant it to brown ash, but also take it away from whatever condition it assumes after. So we can maintain these sites, there's a potential that we might be able to rematriate the species at that site. The other factor too to consider though is if we're going to try and maintain some sites long term, we can do the genetic testing in a controlled setting in a common garden experiment, but there's already going to be these natural experiments. If we do some management to make that site a little more resilient, meaning we get these small pencil-sized ash trees started now, as emerald ash borer comes through, they'll attack everything down to an inch, a little bit more, especially if the emerald ash borer gets to a really high population level. But that initial wave will survive if there's lots of these pencil-sized trees. And so they may be the next generation at that site. In the future, the hope is that emerald ash borer populations are going to be lower than they are now. Even if we took like Manchurian ash, where there's actual genetic resistance in Asia, put it here in North America ahead of emerald ash borer, it would die. All of them would die. They can't handle this level of emerald ash borer population. So in a thought, we want to try and maintain some natural cover of ash, hoping that maybe there are some existing genetically resistant. It's more of a tolerance than it is a resistance, right? They can handle a little bit of emerald ash borer impact. No ash tree can handle this much impact that we're seeing.
Great work.
Thanks. So we have there's a question, someone's raised their hand on Zoom, so I'm gonna go ahead and maybe I can unmute them. Maybe, no, wait, we haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I mean,
Hold on. Oh, did she?
and then
And then I did, okay, I'm touching anything now. Okay, I think we're all set. You can ask your question.
Uliuni Nidombach. I'm Christina from Vermont. And I was very pleased to hear that one of your recommendations is that we do leave some ash standing, especially seed-bearing trees. And I wonder if you know of a forester here in Vermont who would be helpful to landowners in educating them about what trees to save, because the initial response here when we heard emerald ash borer was moving north into our region was that you should cut everything down. And we know that this is folly, and that the old people tell us that the ash have been threatened in the past by various pathogens, and and that it's very important to steward these trees, which are so important to the people here.
Yeah, I think that's great. The more ash that we can keep up, the better, especially seed-bearing trees. For your recommendation of a forester, I know that Nancy Patch is really involved in our collaboration. She's a forester in Vermont. I'm not exactly sure where she's based, but I believe she works for the state of Vermont. So connecting with her might be a good route to get the word out.
And you guys have, you can feel free to email me if you want to get in touch with them, but the APCAW website also has contact information for the team. So if you have trouble finding her or wanna reach out for more specific things, that all their contact information is there. So thanks for your question. So I'm gonna take a question from the chat and then I'm gonna take a question from the room, okay? There's so many people have so many things to say. And the first is a kind of, I think a technical question about, are all ash trees on the same schedule? Like, does it affect them in the same way? And I guess I would want clarification I'm not sure the question is schedule, I think. For seeding. Yeah, I think it's the seeding. So yeah, like, is it the case that it's a kind of synchronized across the species, or is there kind of local variation in terms of that mass year for seeding?
Yeah, there's a lot of local variation. 2 years ago, we saw a ton of seed in southern Maine, but not as much in northern Maine. And then there was a little brown ash seed in northern Maine this year. So I think it varies region to region, but generally within the same region, they're all masting at the same time.
Yeah, it is a masting species, so it does synchronize among its own species a seed year. And for brown ash, it doesn't necessarily have to take 8 years. It may take 3 years. It's just anywhere from 0 to 8 years. So we don't know. That's why we have to monitor all the time. And there are some opportunities to collect here and there when there's small pockets that seem to oddly fruit when others don't. And a lot of times, unfortunately, though, those seeds are empty. So it'll still produce seeds, samaras, but they won't have the fruiting body. It'll just be an empty case.
Scott, you want to be next?
Sure. So my impression, which is based on working in the woods for a long time, geographic scientific study, is that brown ash in this area has been declining for some time. I'm wondering if you were aware of other threats to the species, maybe before ash borer came, or is there any research and fine tune our understanding of where it grows, the best sites?
Yeah, so from a climate perspective, brown ash is not a climate winner, as they say a lot. So it's been shrinking in terms of its range, especially in the southern parts of New England. So that's a big contributing factor. Ella mentioned how the basket makers voiced concern about the health of brown ash. It actually was unrelated to emerald ash borer then. It was just decline. So a top-down decline that seemed to be impacting a lot of the sites. The ice storm of '98 had a huge impact on ash forests because they're wetland species. They were really vulnerable to that sort of frost damage. This seems to be more common. We see lots of frost events that are kind of weird timing. They're in wet ground, so there's also wind issues. If there's a microburst, which that seems to be a hot term lately, lots of microbursts impact our forests now. So you lose a lot of the windfell. Frost damage, and then because they're just tough sites, I mean, these trees thrive there because no other trees can really handle it. They're vulnerable to lots of different pathogens and pests, and so they're just really going through the brunt of what it is for forest health concerns outside of emerald ash borer. Then you throw that in there as well. It's really kind of a dark look for it, but some of these sites there are still persisting, and they're in my eyes. If you can map where they're really healthy and growing well, those are potential refugia spots where the emerald ash borer comes through, both from a climate perspective and combating emerald ash borer. Those are sites to try and protect because, like you said, it is seemingly not as abundant as maybe it was at one point.
And I don't know if this is backed up by research, but I would suspect that the prolonged flooding is probably a shock to brown ash's system. Like even on our way over here, I got the flood warning. And I know that you guys have dealt with a lot of flooding recently, so it might have something to do with that too. We're just not used to the level of flooding that there is.
Megan, it's Andy McLean. I
Hi.
don't, I can't figure out how to raise a hand. So when it's my turn, I have a question. I think
Okay,
there's some others who are waiting right now.
okay, I'll take one question from the chat and then you'll be next, Andy, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, so the question from the chat is a kind of region-wide. So is APCAW interested in region-wide data? I work for New England Forestry Foundation and we're exploring the possibility of doing brown ash inventory, then possibly seed collection on our fee lands. The only problem is the readily available volunteers are available in southern New England. Has that region already been deemed a lost cause, or is inventory data helpful there? We have properties in Maine and New Hampshire. Just need to do more legwork before we can do the inventory there. So,
Yeah, I think inventory anywhere is really, really helpful. One thing that we're thinking a lot through this, like what to do with data about brown ash, and recognizing that because it is a culturally significant species, there's a lot of concerns around it being misused, the data. So we want to make sure that it's protected in the right ways and gets into the right hands. We actually had a similar nonprofit come to us in Maine recently, who's been doing a lot of inventory work, which is really great to have all that data out there, and offer us some of the data for tribal nations to work with, specifically for basket makers to maybe find more stands that they could use for harvesting. But because there are like inter-community concerns, like about who gets that data and who has priority access to it, we're still like working out all the different complications of how to manage it. But I would recommend in general, just reaching out to your local tribal nation and seeing if they could find use for that data. As well as APCAW, we don't have a place to store inventory data at APCAW at this point, but we may in the near future. But if you can use it for referring people to seed collection sites, I think that's really, really great.
and I mean, one thing I've taken away from learning about all this is it's sort of never too late to do the inventory, that there is no moment of lost cause, because 99, you know, the way I always think about it is that 99% mortality is horrible, but there's that 1%, right? And that 1% is, you know, is the seed we want to be thinking about, is the, you know, can we get seed from those trees? Can they go to Pensick? Can they go to these labs that are growing them out and, you know, using them in the breeding programs? And so the kind of, you know, even if there's a high mortality rate in your area, it's still worth putting on your muck boots, going out, counting those trees, seeing if there is still some viability in those stands.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think that's an overstatement of
No.
the case, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely worth still looking. And the reason we're really excited about the Penn State work is that there has never been a whole genomics study for ash. So we don't know how distinct populations are. We could find out that southern New England is vastly different genetically from central Maine and from northern Maine. We don't know. I mean, we can hypothesize that we think it's probably pretty similar, but we can't know for certain until we do seed collection. And seed collection, although it's really fun, is a lot of work. And if you know where the ash trees are and how they're faring, you can prioritize your efforts when it comes time to collect seed and be really productive at getting the most of big seed here.
Thanks. Andy?
The first time I learned about brown ash and its importance to tribal nations for basket weaving was on a cross-country ski trip in northern Maine near Moosehead Lake with Steve Tatko of the Appalachian Mountain Club. I'm wondering if you folks know Steve and have worked with him.
Yeah, I know him well, and he's done a really innovative job of creating ash harvesting permits for tribal nations in Maine. So he's a close collaborator of ours and a good friend.
That's great,
Great
because
guy.
he's just terrific. Now, is the Appalachian Mountain Club one of your partners? If they're not, they should be.
They've attended a lot of our events and they're pretty engaged. Yeah, I would call them our partners.
Would you like their logo along with the others?
Huh?
Putting,
you
he
like to
asked about
have
putting the
their-
logo on.
I should
Would you-
put, yeah, I should put them up.
Well,
We'd
no,
have so
I-
many logos if we included everybody's logos.
That might
Oh,
be
well,
it.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell Steve that he needs to convince you to make room for the AMC logo.
I will. Great, thanks, Andy. So we had another question in the room, yeah.
I'd say this, quick question about the second slide, you mentioned that New Hampshire was a state that no longer quarantines. Do you know the history of that and why it doesn't and will it be open in the future? And I would assume that's a value.
Yeah, I mean, there are still some areas that haven't been impacted by emerald ash borer, so quarantine does slow the spread of emerald ash borer. There's still lots of advertisement on the movement of firewood in New Hampshire to try and limit that spread. There are still efforts to detect emerald ash borer in areas where it hasn't been detected. But the reason why it was delisted was the federal government delisted emerald ash borer in 2018. Which unfortunate for Maine was exactly when it arrived in Maine. But once APHIS did, a lot of states followed suit and got rid of the emerald ash borer quarantine. And big focus of that was, it takes a lot of money to monitor for emerald ash borer. It takes a lot of funds and staff time to update these quarantines, lots of public hearings, meetings. Let's focus on this strategy that seems to have some hope, which was biocontrol. And so a lot of focus has been shifted to biocontrol and now even insecticide treatment. So it's a little bit of a shift in terms of strategy, but they're still monitoring. It's not completely ignored by any means.
Just trying to add.
Oh, and yeah, so I can comment on that real quick. So I'm Bill Davis and I work with the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands with Kyle. And I'm involved with a lot of the survey and decision making with quarantines and things like that. And in New Hampshire, we did maintain a county by county quarantine. So for federal regulations, county is kind of the smallest block that we can work with for quarantines. And we maintained a county by county quarantine until we found emerald ash borer in Grafton County, which I think was the 8th out of the 10 counties in New Hampshire. At which point, we were quarantining 80% of the state from moving into the 20% of the state. And at that point, it just became kind of not really practical to maintain that quarantine. And we felt that the kind of economic restrictions that it was imposing on a lot of the industry in the state was not worth the benefit of potentially moving, maintaining the quarantine. And part of that decision was because most of the ash resource in the state is in White Mountain area, Carroll County and Grafton County, Connecticut River flood or Connecticut River Valley and Sullivan, Cheshire and Grafton County. And there's really not a whole lot of ash in Powys County. And so there wasn't a whole lot of resource that we felt that we were protecting up there. Obviously there's still ash there. We want to protect it, but it didn't seem feasible to keep the quarantine at that point.
Thanks.
And featured in my community meeting videos. After you spoke, I read.
The things that happen when you only know people on Zoom. Yeah. Or the phone. I feel like we've only spoken on the phone. And I was like, it seems possible that's who you are. So yeah, thanks for coming and pitching in here. Yeah.
I have a question about brown ash swamp here in the area. We snowshoot and hike through there. Is there a tribe that has taken over that, or is that part of the White Mountains National Forest and hopefully is being protected?
I'm not aware of the particular site. And I think if Kyle isn't, he would be interested in protecting that site as a long-term monitoring law.
If it's on national forest, we don't have any jurisdiction around that tree, national forest regionally.
But I could connect with Nate about that site that is on the national, Nate Seeger. Forest Service.
I don't know how many are left in there, but,
Right.
there's quite an extensive beaver.
The beavers
Area
have
there.
taken most of the ground. I think in the 20 years that we've played, 20+ years we've played that trail, it went from being very tree dominated to almost no trees. And so it is, and it went from 1 beaver pond to 7 ponds, varying sizes, so. And it is, that property is controlled.
And the national, so the comment period ends tomorrow, March 8th, but the National Forest is working on a ash protection project that in the White Mountain National Forest, and I think it's 80 sites that they've identified. Does that number sound right? I'm getting some nods from other people who would know. So they, you know, there is work that's happening in the, you know, with the Forest Service. Other people are nodding in the room who might know more about this, or at least the details. So there is stuff that's happening, and should that project go forward, we're hoping this summer to do an event with some folks from the Forest Service to help us all learn more about the work that they're doing here in our region as well. So there was one more question in the chat, and then we're just about out of time about, you know, are there kind of plant communities that support, so the question was sort of about companion planting and plant communities from a garden perspective. You know, are there, you know, has there been research, or have you found that if ash is near X other plants, it supports their health or things like that? Is there any research in that area, or?
Yeah, it's not so much like like a lot of in forestry, that application does exist, and you have like Norway spruce. Norway spruce is the bird host for white pine weevils, so they'll try to plant Norway spruce near their white pine in hopes that would draw the attention there and save the more valuable crop trees. So I think that's the route that you're thinking there, and that's not so much the case with ash. Unfortunately, there isn't an alternative sink host, but you can use sink trees. So if you do trap trees locally, it will bring the emerald ash borer population into that tree. You can inject that tree, cut that tree, get rid of it, and dispose of the beetles that sunk into it. But it's really a short-term situation. It doesn't last long-term. It can help manipulate the local distribution of emerald ash borer in a site, which is sometimes valuable in buying a little bit more time for, let's say you have a nice basket quality brown ash stand on the other end. If you girdle a white ash on the other end, maybe sacrifice that to help buy some time. That can happen.
If the question is asking like what other species ash supports, it supports a ton of species. There was just a recent study that came out that found that there are 96 species of insects that depend solely on brown ash. So if we lose the brown ash, we're going to lose all 96 of those species. And also they stabilize the floodplain, so they create habitat for fiddleheads, which are another culturally important species, as well as other species. So I think we're going to see a lot of ecological collapse if the brown ash is lost from these floodplains.
Thank you for the help in the chat with the specifics, so that it is 80 sites. I had that number right, including 10 brown ash sites. So mostly in New Hampshire, but 20 sites in Maine. So the National Forest, as I'm sure most people in this room know, includes part over in Maine as well. We've gone over our hour. I'm sure there's more questions here, but thank you both for your time. It was really great to have you here and have an opportunity to learn in person from you. I mean, I did come to the seed workshop in September, but it's great to see you and have you here with us. And thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom. As I said at the beginning, this talk is part of a series that's sponsored by NEH Spotlight on Humanities grant. We'll have 3 more events this semester supported by that grant, as well as upcoming Mountain Voices talks in March, April, and May. No, March and April. There's only 2 more. And so I hope you'll join us for those. And I know, looking in the room and looking on Zoom, that some of you already are supporters of the museum. If you aren't already, I hope you'll consider becoming a member. The money we raise from our membership program is how we support most of our exhibitions and programming. So your support really matters to what we're able to do here. So thank you all for coming and for your support.